How exactly shall a game or playing help me or even my business? Good question. Well, did you know that people who regularly engaged in wargaming were able to come up with and compare detailed plans of action, sometimes in mere minutes, while their peers, who didn't, needed significantly longer? You can find the statement by a US Army Simulations Directorate official in our series on the military decision-making process, which also features business examples for every step. Our focus today is on the historical military simulation system developed in the 19th century in Prussia for exactly this, military competition education purposes. It was used to conduct combat exercises on game boards, which have been continuously optimized throughout history to support leadership training, while also further evolving, building the basis into, or for a wide range of leisure games you might be familiar with, as for example Dungeons & Dragons. With a consistent scale, a game ceases to be an abstraction like chess and begins to develop into something entirely new, a simulation. John Peterson, Playing at the World, a history of simulating wars, people and fantastic adventures, from chess to role-playing games. Okay, that doesn't sound too bad in principle. But what exactly is wargaming? Even hundreds of years ago, it was already pondered. It, the wargame, actually complements studies of military history by giving us the opportunity to test how well we can apply the abstractions we have gained to concrete cases. In The Fog of War, a report on the reconstruction of war school and wargaming in Prussia from 1815, Dr. Martin Klöffler, cartographer, e-journal Napoleon Online. Perhaps the most persistent and well-known of predecessors yet is chess, which likely originated in the 5th century. It was cherished by countless kings and nobles, spread rapidly across the globe, and has been endlessly developed and modified further over the years. However, despite the game's high entertainment value and its ability to help people train their strategic thinking, it is difficult or rather impractical to use it as a true war simulation. This fact has always been quite frustrating for many military enthusiasts who have tried to turn the game into something more practical. You're surely familiar with the basics of chess, however, if you have never particularly enjoyed it, that is okay too, because on one hand, thinking is one of the most strenuous activities, which is why the brain always tries to take the easy way, which one might often succumb to, and on the other hand, chess is indeed quite one-dimensional and rather abstract. It was precisely these later problems with chess that led to the creation of more and more variants over time, culminating in things you might have seen, for example, in series like The Big Bang Theory. However, this too is again too abstract, which is why military enthusiasts often face the problem of having to massively abstract, making it difficult to integrate chess into any training in a practical manner. This finally changed in the 19th century. A parallel factor not to be underestimated was that cartography faced significant challenges, and it was only during this time that more precise and particularly to scale maps began to become available. Until then, their maps were abstract representations, while the bird's perspective was a very hard to grasp concept for lack of actual experience to stimulate one's forked experimental capacities, something to base such drawings on. The corresponding spread of these maps fit excellently with the development of the Prussian wargame, one of the first systems to simulate warfare realistically, and which served as the basis for many of our own board games. This includes the tabletop game Warhammer 40k, which we also discussed in a recent episode, but also distantly inspired other classic modern hits like the role-playing game D&D. Returning to chess, over the centuries the board, pieces, rules and even the number of players were fascinatingly experimented with. One of the most interesting variants was developed in 1664 by Christoph Weichmann and called the newly invented Great Game of Kings. He expanded the complexity of the pieces to 30, each corresponding to contemporary roles of marshal, colonel, herald, soldiers and so on. Most importantly, he abandoned the square grid system in favor of a more flexible circular system that allowed movement in many directions. In the following century, many followed with their own adaptations of this game. These innovations eventually broke with the traditional principles of chess to establish something new. Johann Helwig, a professor in Braunschweig in the late 18th century, was the first true pioneer in this new field. While trying to teach students military science, he published the first edition of his own wargame in 1782. The significance of his work lay in the fact that Helwig fundamentally reconsidered movement and displacement, devised novel victory conditions, and gave his game both a concrete framework for the terrain and the fighters instead of an abstract one. As you can see, the black and white chessboard was replaced by a colored version of the terrain, which could impose movement restrictions or provide combat advantages. The terrain could also change as cities, villages, and fortifications arose or fell, and as bridges or supply lines were established. All this was adjustable depending on the simulated scenario. The units were remarkable, as they now represented a variety of contemporary troops that could be deployed at the start of the game and moved in any direction. Additionally, further improvements were made in combat, such as the introduction of a strength system to determine the outcome of certain encounters, like attacks and fortifications. Note, modern military defines a minimum of 3 up to 7 to 1 advantage in numbers when attacking a defending force, with the latter number being applied in urban environments, Häuserkampf. In 1803, a second edition of the game was published, introducing further innovations. These included custom miniature figures and new aspects of conflict resolution, such as considering the direction units are facing and dividing movement and combat into 2 distinct phases within the same round. The game became increasingly commercialized and used by a broader audience. Helvig's game inspired numerous contemporary imitators whose work wonderfully coincided with the advances in 19th century cartography. In the past, our ancestors viewed the world mostly from the ground, not from a bird's eye view. Their maps were abstract representations of reality without an adequate method to define and depict things accurately. For relatively simple aspects of warfare, this was somewhat negligible at the time. However, the invention of gunpowder and the explosive increase in the complexity of warfare required more details. Subscribe to our channel to not miss our take on the several generations of complexity of warfare, including some theories and deductions on the contemporary 5th generation. The Renaissance and subsequent periods of scientific progress made this increasingly possible. In the early 19th century, European general staffs devoted a lot of time to surveying and cartography as they prepared to conduct their continental wars on an unprecedented scale of planning and organization. This had a profound impact on the wargaming community as well. To quote John Peterson again, "Once you have a map with a scale, even if it's just a square mile equating to 1,000 steps, you have opened the door to a much higher degree of realism in wargames. In wargames, scale is a tool that ties the system to the environment. When soldiers in the game march a certain number of squares in one round, that number can now be converted into an absolute distance from which we can ask, how long would real soldiers take to cover the distance? This then gives us a sense of the actual duration of rounds. We can then examine the distance that light and heavy cavalry could plausibly cover at the same time, and determine whether their movement in the game system is realistic compared to infantry. Similarly, we can compare the actual distances that different types of artillery can shoot with the set spatial distance of the game squares and adjust the game behavior of the artillery accordingly. I hope this section gives you an idea of why accurate cartography was so important for the development of wargames. One should also note that if you were looking for some of the best cartography of the time, you didn't need to look further than Prussia. Seriously, check out Oversimplified's take on the War of the Pig if you want an example of historical hiccups going back onto contemporary cartography. The Prussians were masters of their craft and had sworn to never again suffer the humiliating defeats they experienced in the early days of the Fourth Coalition War against Napoleon. Thus the famous wargame was invented here. The inventor of this new wargame was Georg Leopold von Reisswitz. He grew up studying military history under the guidance of his father, a veteran, and became one of the first users of Helvig's game, which we discussed earlier. This might have provided mental escape for the young man who dreamed of military campaigns he could not participate in due to an arm injury at the time. At the officers' school, Reisswitz shared his passion for wargames with his friends. Since they could not afford the expensive Helvig game, they made their own copy. They worked together on the system and even developed a way to play by mail. After graduating in 1810, Reisswitz met with one of his schoolmates to discuss further improvements to the game. They concluded that the grid system fundamentally limited the accuracy of wargames and began experimenting with alternative systems. Reisswitz eventually decided to use damp sand to form realistic terrain and develop new rules for this gridless system. At some point, their experiments attracted the attention of educated Prussian circles. Soon Reisswitz was invited to Berlin to give a demonstration to the princes. He brought the hand-shaped model with hills, valleys, rivers, roads and extreme details. The model had a much higher resolution than previous system, with battlefield units represented as colored troops that could be moved freely. The demonstration immediately captured the imagination of the crowd, and the king himself showed interest. However, Reisswitz was not ready to present to his ruler with an elaborate sandbox. He took a full year to prepare a more suitable demonstration. In 1812, Reisswitz returned to the palace with the following. It had the form of a large table, open at the top to accommodate the terrain, The terrain pieces as well as the overall area had been enlarged. The small squares could be rearranged, allowing for a variety of landscapes. The terrain was made of plaster and colorfully designed to depict roads, villages, swamps, rivers, and so on. Additionally, there were measures for gauging distances, rulers, small fog of war boxes that could be placed over areas to enable surprise attacks by unobserved troops, as well as written rules, which were not yet complete. The pieces to represent the troops were made of porcelain. The entire setup was extremely well painted. The game undoubtedly made a significant impression and was frequently played by members of the royal family and nobility. However, the main disadvantage was that this was a custom-made gift for a monarch, making it unsuitable for wider distribution. Ultimately, it was Reisswitz's son, Georg Heinrich Rudolf Johann von Reisswitz, who further developed the game. Unlike his father, the younger Reisswitz was heavily involved in actual combat operations. He was one of the many young Prussians who joined the military to fight against Napoleon and quickly rose through the military ranks. In 1813, he even received the Iron Cross for his bravery. After the war, the young man was assigned to the Prussian artillery and eventually served in the Guard Artillery Brigade in Berlin. It was around this time that he reportedly began to seriously consider continuing his father's work. Reisswitz's Jüngeren efforts bore fruit in 1824, with the publication of a new edition of Kriegsspiel. This included remarkable changes, such as an increase in map resolution and a shift from three-dimensional terrain to flat maps that now use the latest topographical cartography to depict the terrain. However, the most significant changes were the addition of umpires and dice. To briefly summarize their importance, umpires allowed for a more flexible interpretation and application of the otherwise dense and rich rules, while dice helped to model randomness on the battlefield. The umpire was an important party with great responsibility. First and foremost, he set the wargame scenario and dictated the size and composition of both forces. Reisswitz Jr. explicitly emphasized that the conditions did not need to be balanced and symmetrical, as one might expect in a game like chess. Instead, they should strive to model real conditions under which one army might be significantly stronger than another, requiring different tactics to achieve victory. Once the setup was complete, both players sat at separate tables with empty maps. The umpire placed the pieces representing each side according to their planned deployment on the map. Only units within the line of sight were shown to the enemy. This added an important level of strategic thinking, which we now know as the fog of war. It also prevented players from predicting their opponent's movements and assessing the overall course of the battle, something that would have been impossible without an umpire. In each round, players then had 2 minutes to issue orders. The umpire then interpreted these orders, executed them, and informed the players of the results. Reisswitz explicitly stated that umpires were not there to criticize the players' decisions. Instead, they should objectively describe the consequences of these. For example, a player might want to attack a village. The umpire would then consult the table to determine the outcomes of various possible encounters. This solution method established a fundamental principle of modern Kriegsspiel, that the rules provided a framework, but the umpires delivered the interpretation. The introduction of dice added another layer of realism by accounting for chance. Again, Reisswitz went beyond simply saying roll the dice and highest wins. Instead, he used dice to model probabilities, allowing factors like morale and losses to be represented in a way that simply deterministic rules could not. For example, an infantry battalion attacking a cavalry squadron might face different dice rolls depending on their morale. The dice results thus introduced variability that reflected the uncertainties and unpredictability of actual combat. This combination of cartography, umpiring, and probabilistic outcomes truly set Reisswitz's Kriegsspiel apart from its predecessors, and offered a versatile and realistic wargame that could be used both for military training and leisure game. This game had a profound impact on military tactics and the training of officers, particularly in the Prussian military, laying the foundation for modern wargames. So while earlier forms of chess and its variants laid the groundwork, it was Kriegsspiel that ushered wargames into a new era of realism and practical applicability. This marked the emergence of the wargame systems we know today, bridging the gap between abstract strategy games and real military simulations. For more information and development of impact of wargames, some of our sources, please see the description. To once again cite Dr. Martin Klöffler, the only way to learn about war in peacetime is the study of military history. The wargame actually complements the study of military history by giving us the opportunity to test how well we can apply the abstractions we have gained to concrete cases. In this spirit, we hope that the approaches and valuable knowledge provided have somewhat satisfied your curiosity in this regard. If so, please let us know with a like, subscription and comment. The latter especially helps with increasing reach. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you for your attention. This concludes my elaborations.